All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of History with me, Mr. Calloway. So, we've already gone over some content with Mrs. Robinson about Reconstruction, and this is where, just like with last time, I'm going to come in and add a little bit more and give a little more details because I know you guys have said you like details. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, first things first, you're going to go ahead and make some notes on this one. All right. You can just label your notes impacts of Reconstruction and then today's date. Perfectly fine. This is a recording, so I'm going to go just a little bit faster than normal because you can always just pause it and go back if you need to. So for your first section, we're going to talk about the 13th Amendment. So that's what you can write down for your subheading, 13th Amendment. You don't need to write this word for word. What this is just the language in the 13th Amendment. Now, let's read it together. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. All right, so that's the first section. Now, the second section reads, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Okay, so the 13th Amendment is supposed to then end slavery. That is the goal of the 13th Amendment. Now, that's not exactly what happened, and in this lesson, we're going to get into how exactly it is that this went haywire, okay? But just like with our last lesson, we're going to address some misconceptions. While this is aimed largely at, ending slavery and allowing African Americans to become citizens, it is applied to all racial minorities, not just Black people. Okay, so for this part, you can, under 13th Amendment, applies to all racial minorities. Okay, so speaking to California specifically, at this time, Asians, there are a lot of Asian people who have moved from places like China in particular, but also places like the Philippines, to come and be in California for the gold rush, for example. So now, because of the 13th Amendment, they can also apply for citizenship if they are naturalized or were born here. So that was something that was really important to them as well. Now, let's talk about how the 13th Amendment went sideways. So for this section, you can just write 13th loophole. All right, here's your loophole, because you guys said you wanted pictures. So here's your first picture. So as soon as this South sees the 13th Amendment, which the South, by the way, had not really any say in the 13th Amendment. They didn't get to have the choice to ratify it or to say no. I should put it that way. They didn't get the choice to say no. If they wanted to rejoin the Union, they had to ratify it. So they're not happy about it, but they accept it. But they also find the loophole in it, okay? So according to Section 1, if a person is a convict, they can be used for labor as long as they are duly convicted in the legal system. That just means as long as they have been arrested, had a trial, what the jury appears, et cetera, right? So if we go back to this, except as a punishment for crime, okay? And this right here is the loophole that the South is going to use to try to re-enslave the newly freed African Americans, all right? So this loophole is going to become known as the convict lease system. All right. What is the convict lease system? Let's get into that a little bit more. So here's how the convict lease system works. Okay. Step 1. Southern whites make laws that specifically target Black people. Okay. And these laws can be anything, and most of them are totally dumb. Most of them are just the old slave codes that we talked about during before the Civil War, that have just been modified to be what will be known as the Black Codes, and we'll talk about the Black Codes. But these can be anything. This can be if a Black person is outside after dark, if a Black person owns a firearm, if a Black person is rude to a white person. These are all reasons under the Black Codes, which were put in as local and state law, that a Black person could be tried or arrested as a criminal. So you make these laws, then you go to step 2. You arrest black people and put together a quick sham trial and a jury that is all white. Okay. Now, the majority of black people who are arrested during this time, they're arrested predominantly for two things. First, they're arrested for vagrancy. All right. Mrs. Robinson talked about vagrancy. Vagrancy is basically just this umbrella term for whatever they want to justify arresting this black person for, right? The second the reason that African Americans are arrested is for the crimes they commit. Now, that might seem obvious, but if we look at what kind of crimes they're being arrested for, they're being arrested for things like stealing a pig. They're being arrested for things like trying to take food, or things that are basically survival related, right? Not everyone is in a very good place economically at the end of slavery, and so it's a lot of survival crimes, like trying to get enough food, trying to get shelter, trying to get clothing. These are the majority of actual crimes, like real crimes that black people are arrested for during the period of Reconstruction. Most of the others are just trumped up stuff that was ridiculous. Anyway, after you've had your jury of all white people say, you know what, you're right, they're guilty. And sometimes these trials, guys, would just be as simple as they read the charges, the jury said guilty without even meeting, and then they moved on. That's how quick these were sometimes. So that goes into step 3. You find the black person guilty of a crime, imprison them. Now that they are imprisoned under the 13th Amendment, it is okay to use them as labor, okay? So here's what they do then. They collect in black prisoners, and then they put them together in what was known as chain gangs. Okay, remember Mrs. Robinson used that term, chain gangs. We'll get into that in just a second. But you get enough of them together in a chain gang, and then you have companies, and most of these companies are agricultural companies that just so happen to be like the old plantation owners, but now they're a quote unquote company. Okay, you have those companies have a little auction. I mean, an auction, like a slave auction used to be, an auction for a certain amount of time for these prisoners to work hard labor. At that point, once the company has won the bid, you allow that company to work the prisoners to the bone, and in many cases to the death. There is a video linked in the previous slide, which I encourage you all to go and look at it. But during slavery, you didn't want slave masters, not you, slave masters didn't want to work slaves too hard, not to death, because that hurts your bottom line. You have to pay to replace that slave. Under the convict lease system, it doesn't matter if you work that person to death, because there's going to be someone else who can replace them, right? So the labor in the chain gangs was far more brutal than what it was under slavery, because these people just didn't care anymore. Like there was no financial repercussion on them if they worked a prisoner to death, like it would be if they had worked a slave to death. It's some really messed up stuff. So here is some pictures, okay? Now I put the dates on these because that's very important. So remember, Reconstruction is happening towards the end of the Civil War and into the 1870s. Chain gangs continue into the 1900s. All right. These are two gentlemen who you can see the ball and chain wrapped around that's around their waist and around their ankle. So sweeping streets in Washington, D.C. This one right here. This is a chain gang of juveniles. Some of these kids look like they're between 9 and 12 years old. I would be surprised if any of them were older than 13 or 14. Right. So they targeted anyone and everyone when it came to trying to round up people to put into these chain gangs. And as you can see, this is a group of, 9 to 13-year-olds with hoes, right, out working fields. And it looks like that's corn, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm no farmer, so don't quote me on that. Um, yeah, these are messed up, and they continue well past the age of Reconstruction. Okay, um, so yeah, let's talk a little bit then about the black codes that made it possible for white people to do this to freed African Americans. So we remember this picture. All right, we saw this in Mrs. Robinson's presentation. But the black codes were essentially, like I said before, they are the slave codes with a different name. Okay, sometimes they are just straight up copy pasted, like there's no changes to them. Other times it's minor changes so that it doesn't say the words like slave, right? But they are specifically targeting African Americans and trying to impose the same kind of restrictions on them as when they were slaves. Okay, they are enforced at the local and the state level. And this is important because if they're enforced at the federal level, one, it's not going to pass, but two, the federal government can get involved. So Southern Democrats, Southern whites were very careful about how they enforced the black codes because if it went up to the federal level, it would be shut down. Okay. Now, this might bring up the question for some of you then why didn't the North, if they knew this was going on, right? The rest of the country knew this was going on. Why didn't they step in? Well, take a step back and reflect on our previous lecture together. Remember what I said about the North, how we have the false assumption that because the North fought against the South, that it was against racism. That's not true. Okay. Not many people in the North were against racism. Most of the people in the North were racist. Some of you did use that topic for your last assignment and did a very good job on that. So even though they know that this is going on, doesn't mean that they really care. Okay. The other way in which the South begins to try to resubjugate African Americans is through the practice of sharecropping. All right, and we talked about this with Mrs. Robinson as well. Sharecropping, and you can just write this for your heading, sharecropping, is a system used to keep black and poor white farmers in poverty while benefiting plantation owners. Okay. This is important. It wasn't just black people. The majority of sharecroppers were black people, but white people were also sharecroppers. If you look at these two pictures, these are sharecroppers from the 1930s. The 1930s. Okay, it's important again to note that date. This is well past Reconstruction. Okay, this is decades since Reconstruction. And these are still the life experiences of people in the South. Okay. Sharecropping is a system that is designed to keep these people, especially African Americans, in a life that looks like this. Okay. A sharecropping means that you have a little plot of land that you rent from the owner of the land, usually the old plantation owners. You have to pay them rent, and or you have a certain amount of your own crops that you grow that you have to give to them, okay, to the landowner. So the deals were oftentimes written up in contracts, and these contracts were very, very, very one-sided, right? They were designed so that they would be impossible for black people in particular to ever get to the point that they would have economic freedom. So while they have more control over their own labor, right, they're not slaves being forced to work for free to grow crops, they are still receiving, in many cases, pennies on the dollar for the work that they are doing. Okay. And that's why even into the 1930s, which is 60, 70 years past Reconstruction, you still have people who look like this. You still have people who live like this. Okay. Now, you might be wondering why it is that these contracts were so one-sided. Like, why didn't people just like know and argue for a better contract? Well, we discussed in our last lecture about education and the roles that education play in the South and for freed Black people. Okay. We're going to stop here for these notes, and we're going to pick up on education for the next presentation. So for this one, you can just put a line through and then put in and then today's date, and I will see you at the next lecture.